Because understanding great literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. On the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, we commit to reading, dissecting, and analyzing what we believe are the great books of the Western canon. You know, those books, from those authored by Jane Austen to plays authored by Shakespeare, and everything else in between, that you might have fallen asleep trying to read in high school. We do this for our listeners, the small business owner, the entrepreneur, the manager, or the civic leader who doesn't have the time to read, dissect, analyze, and even leverage insights from great literature to execute leadership best practices in the confusing and chaotic postmodern world we all now inhabit. Welcome to the restoration of the best of Western civilization here at the intersection of literature and leadership. Welcome to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast. Hello, my name is Jesan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 186. Opening up from our book today, we're going to pick up in part one, chapter one, and it's going to be part two of chapter one. And we're going to take in the setting for today. And I quote, "And that was the long Salinas Valley. Its history was like that of the rest of the state. First, there were Indians, an inferior breed without energy, inventiveness, or culture. A people that lived on grubs and grasshoppers and shellfish, too lazy to hunt or fish. They ate what they could pick and planted nothing. They pounded bitter acorns for flour. Even their warfare was weary pantomime. Then the hard, dry Spaniards came exploring through, greedy and realistic, and their greed was for gold or for God. They collected souls as they collected jewels. They gathered mountains and valleys, rivers and whole horizons, the way a man might now gain title to build lots. These tough, dried-up men moved restlessly up the coast and down. Some of them stayed on grants as large as principalities given to them by the Spanish kings who had not the faintest idea of the gift. These first owners lived in poor feudal settlements, and their cattle ranged freely and multiplied. Periodically, the owners killed the cattle for their hides and tallow and left the meat to the vultures and coyotes. When the Spaniards came, they had to give everything they saw a name. This is the first duty of any explorer, a duty and a privilege. You must name a thing before you can note it on your hand-drawn map. Of course, they were a religious people, and the men who could read and write, who kept the records and drew out the maps, were the tough, untiring priests who traveled with the soldiers. Thus, the first names of places were saints' names or religious holidays celebrating at stopping places. There are many saints, but they are not inexhaustible, so that we find repetitions in the first namings. We have San Miguel, St. Michael, San Ardo, San Bernardo, San Benito, San Lorenz, San Carlos, San Francisco, and then the holidays, Natividad, the Nativity, Nacimiento, the birth, the Soledad, the solitude. But the places were also named from the way the expedition felt at the time. A Buena Esperanza, good hope, Buena Vista, because the view was beautiful, and Chualara, because it was pretty. The descriptive names followed: Paso de los Robles, because of the oak trees, Los Laureles, for the laurels, Chularcitos, because of the reeds in the swamp, and Salinas, for the alkali, which was as white as salt. Then the places were named for animals and birds seen. Gabelenes for the hawks, which flew in the mountains, Topo for the mole, Los Gatos for the wild cats. The suggestions came from the nature of the place itself. Tasjara, a cup and a saucer, Laguna Seca, a dry lake, Corral de Tierra for a fence of earth, Paricio, because it was like heaven. Then the Americans came, more greedy because there were more of them. They took the lands, remade the laws to make their own titles good. And farmholds spread over the land, first in the valleys and then up the foothill slopes. Small wooden houses roofed with redwood shakes, corrals of split poles. Wherever a trickle of water came out of the ground, a house sprang up, and a family began to grow and multiply. Cuttings of red geraniums and rose bushes were planted in the doorways. Wheel tracks of buckboards replaced the trails, and fields of corn and barley and wheat squared out the yellow mustard. Every 10 miles along the travel routes, a general store and blacksmith shop happened, and these became the nuclei of little towns: Radley, King City, Greenfield. The Americans had a greater tendency to name places for people than had the Spanish. After the valleys were settled, the names of places refer more to the things which happened there, and these, to me, are the most fascinating of all names, because each name suggests a story that has been forgotten. I think of Bolsa Nueva, a new purse, Morocco and Lane Moore. Who was he and how did he get there? Wild Horse Canyon and Mustang Grade and Shirttail Canyon. The names of the places carry a charge of the people who named them, reverent or irreverent, descriptive, either poetic or disparaging. You could name anything San Lorenzo, but Shirttail Canyon or the Lane Moor is something quite different. The wind whistled over the settlements in the afternoon, and the farmers began to set out mile-long windbreaks of eucalyptus to keep the plowed topsoil from blowing away. And this is about the way the Salinas Valley was when my grandfather brought his wife and settled in the foothills to the east of King City. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. With this from Genesis 4:16, our author today opens up a truly expansive novel. Written in the 1940s, but of course based on a life of experiences in the Salinas Valley and first published in 1952, the novel describes on an epic scale what it really means to fall out of the utopian paradise created by a transcendent God into the blood, sweat, and tears of the fallen world we all now, tragically, inhabit. This book has never not been a bestseller since its first publication, and this is because it touches on deeply human themes of loss, regret, trauma, sexual immorality, manipulation, greed, sociopathy, and even the honest differences people can experience who grow up in the same family, raised by two people doing the best that they can. For leaders, this novel is a very easy read, but it is unsettling in its implications and truly groundbreaking in its assumptions about human nature. But not because human beings have changed between the date of its original publication in 1952 and now in the year of our Lord 2026, but because in 2026, we seem to have lost the plot, or at the very minimum, the language to address the perplexing and sinful behavior we see in the humans around us. For all of our technological sophistication, this book proves a point we need hammered home to us in a society like the one in which we live now. Many of us have iPhones, the internet, and social media, and many of us do a lot of things with those things, but we still aren't really sure what any of that actually means. Today on the show, we are revisiting the Salinas Valley of California at the beginning of the last century. You know, the one with dates that began with 19. And we're going to try to extract lessons for leaders that they can apply in this century from John Steinbeck's magnum opus, the second one in his long literary life, East of Eden. Leaders, we've said this on the show multiple times with my guest today, and we'll probably say it again in this recording today. But the more things change, the more they regrettably stay the same. And today, of course, I'm joined by my fellow traveler whose computer has decided that it is going to behave as if it's not living its utopian best life. I'm joined by my co-host and fellow traveler, Tom Libby. By the way, if he cuts out, I'm just going to keep doing this episode without him. We got to be on a roll here. So, how you doing today, Tom?
Well, I think as you've just said, I'm, listen, I owe the computer nothing. Okay. It's well, I think I bought it years before COVID even happened. So that tells you about how old the computer is. It owes me nothing, but I'm getting to the point where now I gotta figure out, do I try to continue the repairs and kick it down the sidewalk a little bit, or do I just bite the bullet and get a new computer? They seem to be commodity at this point, so buying a new computer shouldn't be all that difficult, et cetera, et cetera. But I remember to get into the episode today, and to talk a little bit about your intro and get away from my technology troubles. I remember the first conversation. I remember the first conversation you and I had about this opening, and I remember specifically saying to you, I was having a good day until I heard that, and like in a fictional book, my people are still being like dumped on because if you look at the natives eating grubs and we're too lazy to whatever. Like, come on, enough already. Can we figure out a? Can we just find a book that says we're awesome? I just one book that says that native people are awesome. I'll be happy with that. But again, I understand this is a classic book, and you and I talked about this when we spoke before too. I actually love Steinbeck. He's one of my favorite authors. So it's I'll give him a pass, I guess. It's like
It's the term I believe that he used was weary pantomime. I believe that
yeah,
that was the
yeah,
descriptor that he used. Yeah. He he okay, so just full disclosure to the folks listening today. This is our second time around with this book and with this episode. So we originally, this is a little bit of inside baseball. We tend to record on a Monday for a Wednesday release. Normally we don't record on a Wednesday for a Wednesday release. But because of due to operator error this week, my operator error, we had almost 2 hour long conversation about East of Eden on Monday, and we recorded none of it. So we're back to bite the bullet again, and that's what Tom is referring to. So this is just going to be a lot of references to a conversation that you never heard, but that we recorded. I actually wrote a blog post about this where we behaved as if it were being recorded, which is actually the more interesting thing to me, just at a sort of psychological level, because I was thinking about it afterward, after I got past the initial sort of frustration and anger at myself of my own operator error. And again, having no one to blame this week but myself. And by the way, this has been one more thing in a series of things that just have created a series of Mondays for me this week in my life. It's just been Monday all week. It's always been
just
the
gonna
first
call
day
you.
of the week.
Just gonna call you Lemony Snicket over here. A series of unfortunate events.
Oh my gosh. I will be glad to get out of this week. Like Friday cannot come soon enough. But
Yeah,
but um but this was one of those things where, like, the fascinating thing to me is, again, we acted as if we were being recorded. We behaved as if, and we kind of had a little bit of a disagreement about some of the aspects of the book, and that's all right. We're going to explore some of that today. But we were on our behavior as if we were being recorded. And so, it's one of those chicken and the egg things, like which came first, the good behavior and the respectful dealing with another person, or the technology, like which one of those came first. So anyway, I wrote a whole blog post about that. If you're following me on social media on LinkedIn, you should go connect with me. I repost my blog posts on LinkedIn lately. I've been kind of doing that. I'll be doing that for all the next quarter, and it's called hitting the record button. So you should go check that out. So anyway, it's one of those things. I don't know. I don't know why I felt the need to bring that up. Probably because, you know what? I want everybody to know just how hard it is to put together this show. That's really what it is. That's what everybody to like know, that Tom is not the only one having a crap week at this point. Plus, today in America is, for all those who are international listeners in other places, today is tax day in America. This is the day when you either pay the government money, um, and then there's no or after that. I mean, you might get a refund, but like those are less and less as time has gone on. So I have not received a refund from the tax man in 15 years. Normally I'm paying in. So it's been a good long time. I don't even remember what it feels like to get a refund. Anyway, enough said about that. Back to the book. So John Steinbeck, right? I'm gonna let you kind of go off like you did last time. So talk to me a little bit about John Steinbeck. Talk to me about what you think of him as an author. I know you said that he was one of your favorite authors. Why is that? He I know why he's interesting to me. He's sort of the anti-Hemingway. Um, and he sort of sits in that pantheon of social realist writers, right? But he was unlike an Upton Sinclair, who or William Faulkner, who could probably be accurately compared with. His style was more about um, seeing, at least in my opinion, seeing the nature of who human beings are and just sort of letting them be who they were right on the page. But what did you think of Steinbeck? What do you think of? I know it's been 30 some odd years since you read East of Eden, but what did you think of the book? Are you ready to elevate your leadership journey through exploring the wisdom of the ages? Subscribe to the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast on all major podcast platforms, including Apple iTunes, Spotify, and YouTube Music. You can also find us everywhere else podcasts are available. If you find value in our episodes, please leave a 5-star review on Apple, Spotify, and of course, YouTube. We need those reviews to grow, and it is the truest way to help other leaders and lovers of literature discover this show. And thank you for your support.
Well, to answer your question first about my thoughts on Steinbeck, and again, as I have mentioned, see, I was just going to continue to say, as I've mentioned in the past, I wasn't even going to point out that we had this faux pas on Monday that was your fault. I wasn't even going to go there, but
That's fine.
anyway,
That's
but
fine. That's fine. It's
as I
my fault. It's
mentioned,
fine.
as I mentioned in a previous conversation, uh, I think one of the things about Steinbeck that stood out to me, as you know, and again, this was high school reading for me. So as you mentioned, it was quite a long time ago. But when I think about the quote unquote required reading that we had back then, the Harper Lees of the world, Arthur Miller's, that like I thought Steinbeck was more of a I thought he was more, you even used the word realistic. So I think his characters are relatable. I think that you can see either yourself or you're a family member in that character. I think it was he's very down to earth, salt of the earth kind of writing where in the way that he describes things is very uh non-whimsical, I guess is the word I would the way I would describe it. Like when he describes the valley, like you can picture that in your head. You're not picturing some Lord of the Rings thing where it's like, you know, created in his brain. Like you can tell that it's something real to him. Like I think that's my favorite part. And his characters are such, right? Like whether you're talking about East of Eden or the Grapes of Wrath or Mice of Men, Mice of Men stands out to me even more in that sense too, because he didn't he didn't dance around the issue that George was not intelligent. Like he didn't dance
Hmm.
around the issue that he was a special needs kind of like what we would consider special needs person today, or mentally challenged, however you want to word it. But I think that he did that better than most of the people that I enjoyed reading or I that I read. And I do think that like again the two other authors that I just mentioned, Harper Lee and Arthur Miller, I think they did a pretty good job of it too, which is probably why I like them as well. But I thought Steinbeck was just a cut above. I really do think that you you can truly get a mind's eye because you can relate to what he's writing to something that you yourself have either seen or experienced. Like again, when he's writing the characteristics of a character or the behavioral patterns of a character, you're like, oh, that reminds me of my uncle so and so. Or when he's describing the city surroundings or the country surroundings, you're like, oh, I remember visiting a place like that. Like he's very like it's very relatable to people, and it's very easy to see yourself in the settings that he's describing in the environments. And again, when I say in the settings and environments, I'm not talking specifically or solely about physical environments like the valley. I'm talking about being in the social environments, being in the work. Like
Hmm.
you can see yourself in those environments that he describes. And by the way, even reading through some of the stuff now, like looking back at some of the cliff notes, so to speak, or spark notes, I guess today is the the term. But like even though it was written almost 75 years ago, it still applies. Like I'm
Hmm.
fascinated by the fact that it still applies.
Yep.
So I think for me, I just think Steinbeck was I just think he's a regular guy. Like I think he's a
Yeah.
regular person that had a way with taking what's in his mind and putting it on paper. But if you read it, it's almost like you're looking directly into his experience, and his thought process is directly into his experience. So it's again, and I don't. To me, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about East of Eden or Grapes of Wrath or of Mice and Men or any of the other 50. I don't remember the number, but he wrote dozens and dozens of things. So
Mhm.
it was something like 50 or 60, or I remember the number being very large of his writing. So I just think that most of them were part of his. And you notice too, and you mentioned Hemingway. We were talking about this, and I don't know if you want to talk about this now or if that came later in the show. But like Hemingway, Faulkner, these guys like kind of traveled the world, right? So a lot of their
Yep.
writings are about their experiences around the world. His writings were all about here. Like
Hmm.
he never wrote anything that I remember seeing anyway. It was explicitly about Europe or Asia or any of these
No.
other places where some of these guys have written about. So again, if you're an American citizen and you're here, it's very relatable. Like it's relatable
Hmm.
because it's your country. Like everything he wrote about was your country. It was things that were happening in the moment for him and what was going around the country. And I think some of the and we'll talk about this a little bit later because I know you're gonna ask me, but some of the lessons are still relatable. Like some of the
Hmm.
things that they talk about and the way that you interact with people, the way that you experience human interaction has not changed from the time that he wrote this. So
No.
that's
No.
another part that I found fascinating, but it's like timeless. His writing seems to be timeless.
Well, and this is something that we're going to get into. This ties into something else that we're going to get into because you talk about experience, right? So Steinbeck's experience was very much a rural experience, right? So
Yeah.
we kind of covered this in the shorts episode that precedes this episode. We're at shorts number, I think it's number 219. We talk about the myth of the city. And we're going to get into a little bit of this today as well, talking about Taylor Sheridan and Yellowstone and cultural myths and things like this. But Steinbeck, I believe, fundamentally is the last, or was the not the last, but he was the pinnacle of a breed of writers that had no other choice but to write about what they knew. And if what they knew was the land, or if what they knew was the rural area they had been surrounded by, they were going to ruthlessly mine that they were going to ruthlessly mine that vein of experience, right? And so um he lived in the in the small rural valley of the Salinas Valley. When he was a kid, he spent his summers working on ranches. He labored with migrant workers on sugar beet farms. He graduated from Salinas High School in 1919, literally at the end of World War One, like literally the year after World War One was over. By the way, Hemingway had been in World War One, right? And so Steinbeck missed, the big war, such as it were, of his lifetime. But obviously around for World War II, he reported on his son's I don't want to say adventures, but his son's experience in Vietnam, um, and reported on it not from the sense of, hey, I'm going to go to Vietnam and visit him, but I'm going to write about this in a way that sort of relates or is relatable to people who are still, even in the 1960s, sending their kids to 1950s and 60s, sending their kids to this place where they come from, this rural area. Um, he studied English literature at Stanford University and left without a degree in 1925. He traveled to New York City to try to write, did not make it in New York City, unlike Joan Didion, who I think is his generational successor, who did go from California to New York, and we'll talk about sort of the geography of that in a minute. But then he returned to work in California in 1928, and he began to work as a tour guide and as a caretaker. And he spent a lot of his time doing, quite frankly, what we would call these days menial labor, menial manual labor. His family supported him through the Great Depression, so that he didn't have to do that labor because the Great Depression happened. All those jobs dried up. He lived in a cottage and wrote ruthlessly, but he wrote about the things he saw. And so you could see this in books from Cannery Row or from Tortilla Flat, actually, through Cannery Row, all the way through much later on, his depiction of the Okies coming from the Dust Bowl to California and being discriminated against in the Grapes of Wrath. That was the book that made him. And then, of course, the book that we're talking about today, East of Eden. He defined how rural America in the early to middle 20th century thought about itself, and specifically how they thought about themselves. And I'm going to say this directly and up front, thought about themselves in opposition to the city, not as part of the city, but as a place that was separate from an urban environment. It was distinctly separate from an urban environment. And Steinbeck leaned into that. Whereas guys like Hemingway, to your point, Hemingway, Faulkner, John Dos Passos, even, who is probably the most Americanized out of all those guys, or not Americanized, but American-centric, I should probably say that. But those folks were, they traveled to Europe after they got out of World War I. They were like, how can I go back to Kansas after I've seen Gay Paris, right? And so I'm going to stay in Europe, and I'm going to sort of become part of that lost generation. Steinbeck was the oldest member of the generation that came after the lost generation, right? And so he didn't have a connection to any of that World War I experience other than reading about it in his local newspaper. And for him, in the Salinas Valley, the killing fields of the killing fields and the trench warfare of Europe would have seemed like 10,000 miles away. I can absolutely see that as like a 15-year-old, 16-year-old reading about it in the newspaper, maybe hearing about it on the radio sometimes. Like, we underestimate the distances that people had, because everything now, in our time, is so immediate. The impact of everything is so immediate. And we see the impact of everything on our phones, whether it's happening in Paris or Vietnam or Russia or, downtown in the city that's the major metropolis in our state. Like, we can see all of it because of the phones now. And so the divide between the rural and the urban has shrunk quite a bit. But Steinbeck was probably like I said, the highest pinnacle of that writer, who understood how to write about rural environments and how to give those people pride, while also, of course, showing them being exactly what they are, which is just human beings in another environment that's not an urban environment. As he got older and as society continued to change well into the post East of Eden, as he went into the 50s and 60s, society continued to change. The rural environment continued to decline. And as that happened, Steinbeck became infinitely grumpier. And even though he won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1952, and later on found out that he was sort of a best of the bad lot pick in 1962 for that Nobel Prize for Literature, and was kind of resentful about that, and I can understand why. He wrote his travel book, Travels with Charlie, which I do believe we've covered on this show, and if we haven't, we will, because it is one of his better books, where he's just riding around in this like RV with a dog, looking at the 60s getting ready to happen. He after he got that Nobel Prize in 62, he basically quit writing. He basically put down his pen, and he didn't write anything for the remaining 6 years of his life. It's sort of one of those things where, like, I think of the Daniel Day-Lewis character at the end of There Will Be Blood, based on the book Oil, which we've already covered. You should go back and listen to that episode, where he sort of he kills the preacher kid, Paul Dano, in the bowling alley that he has built into his house. And then he says, come get me, I'm done. And that was basically John Steinbeck to reality. Come get me, I'm done. I'm finished. Um, and it's sort of a, I think biographically, it's sort of a tragic end for to your point, a man who was a towering talent. Um, yeah. So I don't know. I don't know. That's all the background on him. That's some of my thoughts on Steinbeck. Um, East of Eden itself, as a book, though, is well, it's almost 1,000 pages. It is multi-generational. It covers the two families that have settled in the Salinas Valley, the Hamiltons and the Trasks, and goes through 3 generations of their lives and their interactions with each other, their bare interactions with each other, but mostly their interactions with other people, with the families, and of course with the land. Why don't we talk a little bit about California before I jump back into the book? So California is a character in this book. What do you think of California, Tom?
I've been there. It's a nice place to visit, but I wouldn't want to live there. I think, not for any reason other than I don't know. Again, there are some very, very beautiful areas in California. I mean, there's no doubt that it has its attractions, right? And we kind of talked about this in one of our previous conversations about how like, but it's not so much about the actual physical land of California than it is about the mentality and the personality of the land, which leans itself or lends itself to a much more relaxed environment, a much
Mm-hmm.
more um uh accepting environment. There's lots of adjectives here that you can describe it. And we had spoken too about like, I remember I was trying to remember the analogy here that we were talking about the other day, but when we were talking about how like we're all Americans here, right? So I live here in the
Right.
Northeast. Californians live in California. Somebody from California that goes to New York doesn't really do all that well, but somebody from Boston that goes to New York does just fine, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's not, and by the way, California has plenty of cities. LA is one of the
Oh, yeah.
biggest cities in the country, but people who live in LA don't necessarily like being in Boston or New York. It's
Right.
just the personality of the cities are different, right? Like so it's so and we talked about this like even though we're in the same country, it's like people from the Northeast are like it's like France and Germany. Like if you think
Yeah.
about the closeness of France and Germany, but yet somebody from France just doesn't understand somebody from Germany. They don't get it. Like there's lots of cultural things, language things, um, behavioral things that are all different because Germany is Germany and France is France. Well, within our own country, we have the same dynamics. Like think about the people poke fun at the Boston accent all the time, and I try really hard not to have one, and hopefully, it's not blatantly obvious when I speak that I'm from the Boston area, but that's on purpose on my part because I want to be able to interact with people around the country and then have them not know where I'm from just because my mouth opens. Like
Right.
but California, so that's the idea, right? Like so somebody that is born and raised here in the Northeast, again, whether you're Boston, New York, and by the way, I kind of wrap Philadelphia into that environment as well. When I think of the Northeast, I basically think of like Pennsylvania up. And then, so we got these sections of the country that all have these different dynamics. So I get my point to this, I guess, in the rambling nature of this is I think having the landscape as a character in the books makes sense to me because it would be different if you lived in different places in even in our own country.
Yeah.
Like you would have to have you would because somebody who lives in the United States would want to know that. Like what area of
Mm-hmm.
the country is this based on? Like how do I know that it's realistic? If you're taking the same characters from California and they act the exact same way and you tell the reader that they're in New York, it's unbelievable from our perspective. I mean, if
Yeah.
you're selling it worldwide, like to other countries, sure, they don't know any different, so it's fine. But if you're selling it within the borders of our country, you need to have that landscape as a character kind of situation for the reader to make it believable.
Well, and I also think that from Steinbeck's perspective as a writer and as a creator, the land itself as a character has its own personality and it has its own stuff going on. And we're going to talk about this when we talk about Kathy Ames later on. We'll sort of revisit this. But I think a couple of things. One, um I think it's really interesting how, because California is at the end of the continent, that it is perceived as, even in his description there that we opened up with, it is perceived as this paradise by people from back east, right? A place where, the water is, always blue. It's not dirty like the Atlantic. It's always blue. The sun is always shining. Even when I've been to California, like I was in California last year for a training that I had to do with a client. And I got off the plane and I looked around, and my wife says I always say this about places, but it's true. I said the light even looks different here. The sunlight looks different here. And of course, the first question that comes out of my mouth, which is the same question that comes out of my mouth when I go to Florida, by the way, is how do people actually do work here? Like if I lived here, I would never work. I wouldn't hustle at all. Like there'd be no, what is the reason? But that's the perspective. That's an East Coast perspective on
For sure.
on a West Coast sort of posture. And I know they're hustling out there. I know all my California listeners, I know y'all are hustling the heck off out of it. You just hustled Eric Swalwell, out of the Congress. So I know you're getting after it. Like I saw that just happen out of the governor's race in California. But so I know you all can get after it, but the getting after it is at a different speed and at a different template because, and I think Steinbeck was the beginning of sort of setting the template for this. California is sort of the last frontier. It's the last place in America where you can go. Now, of course, people will say, well, you can go to Hawaii. Not in 1952. Now, in 1952, that was not, for a lot of Americans, that was not an option. And for
I mean,
Americans of
Alaska
Steinbeck's,
wasn't a state. Alaska wasn't a state till 1959. So
right, and for Americans of Steinbeck's generation, I mean, the continent ended at the coast of California. Like that's where it ended. Like that was it. And so it was one of those. It's one of those places where, um, well, I had a person from California sort of describe it to me recently in a conversation we were having. He said, Californians both love our state and we hate our state at the same time. And I never heard them sort of frame it that way. Somebody like that frame it that way. He's like, we're in love with the natural beauty and the surfing and the skiing and all of this and the this and the that, but we also like hate it. And I said, well, how is that possible? Because I live in Texas now, and I will tell you right now, people from Texas don't hate their state. I can tell you that right now. And by the way, everybody else in America knows the Texans don't hate their state. What Texans will tell everybody who will listen that they don't hate their state. Everybody knows. Nobody's surprised by this. But to hear that from a Californian, and I've lived other places. I mean, when I lived in, as an example, when I lived in Minnesota, almost everybody that I ever met in Minnesota had this fantasy dream of moving to like Denver, Colorado. They're like, Colorado is the place to be. They all wanted to move to Denver, right? Or when I used to go visit people in Colorado, they had this fantasy of living in like Idaho or Wyoming. There's always a place that's better. But for Californians, there is no place that's better because this is the butt end of the continent. There is no place that's better. There's nowhere else to go unless you're going to go in the ocean. And so you sort of have to make it here, right? But you also have to make it here in what is perceived by others who are not from here as paradise. And the way that Steinbeck describes the Salinas Valley with its alkali sands, and he describes the wind, and he describes like the harshness of the environment when you're trying to farm and trying to pull something from it. It's not paradise. It's just as vicious as any other place where you could go and try to make an agricultural living. And yet, in East of Eden, he describes it with a certain, I'm going to use the term here, a certain love, a certain affection for all of the harshness. a certain affection for all of the toughness that is required to be there. And it is a rural toughness as he presents California as a character. I also think that there's a dichotomy going on here between the rural area and the cities area, and we kind of see it in some of the families that he describes at East of Eden. Which, back to East of Eden. We're going to read like different pieces of this. We're not going to obviously read the whole book. It's 1,000 pages. Can't do that. Plus, it's copywritten, so we have to be careful how many pieces we actually read from it. But suffice it to say, you want to go pick up this book. It's worth your time, and you'll breeze through the almost 1,000 pages fairly quickly. So we're going to pick up here chapter. Let's see, part 1, chapter 5, part 1. Describing one of the families, the Hamiltons, right? On the ranch, the little Hamiltons began to grow up, and every year there was a new one. George was a tall, handsome boy, gentle and sweet, who had from the first a kind of courtliness. Even as a little boy, he was polite and what they used to call, quote unquote, no trouble. From his father, he inherited the neatness of clothing and body and hair, and he never seemed ill-dressed even when he was. George was a sinless boy and grew to be a sinless man. No crime of commission was ever attributed to him, and his crimes of omission were only misdemeanors. By the way, pause. I love that turn of phrase. His crimes of omission were only misdemeanors. Back to the book. In his middle life, and about the time such things were known about, it was discovered that he had pernicious anemia. It is possible that his virtue lived on a lack of energy. I love that turn of phrase, too. Behind George, Will grew along dumpy and stolid. Will had little imagination, but he had great energy. From childhood on, he was a hard worker, if anyone would tell him what to work at, and once told, he was indefatigable. He was a conservative, not only in politics, but in everything. Ideas he found revolutionary, and he avoided them with suspicion and distaste. Will liked to live so that no one could find fault with him, and to do that, he had to live as nearly like other people as possible. Maybe his father had something to do with Will's distaste for either change or variation. When Will was a growing boy, his father had not been long enough in the Salinas Valley to be thought of as a quote-unquote old-timer. By the way, pause. So the Hamiltons were immigrants to California. They were immigrants to this part of the Salinas Valley, as Steinbeck describes them. And they were, Tom, you'll appreciate this being from the Boston area, they were Irish immigrants. Which back in the day meant they were already stamped with the dirty end of the stick. Back to the book. He was, in fact, a foreigner and an Irishman. At that time, the Irish were much disliked in America. They were looked upon with contempt, particularly on the East Coast, but a little of it must have seeped out to the West. And Samuel not only had variability, but was a man of ideas and innovations. In small, cut-off communities, such a man is always regarded with suspicion until he has proved he is no danger to the others. A shining man like Samuel could and can cause a lot of trouble. He might, for example, prove too attractive to the wives of men who knew they were dull. Then there were his education and his reading, the books he bought and borrowed, his knowledge of things that could not be eaten or worn or cohabitated with, his interest in poetry, and his respect for good writing. If Samuel had been a rich man like the Thorns or the Delmars with their big houses and wide flat lands, he would have had a great library. The Delmars had a library, nothing but books in it and paneled in oak. Samuel, by borrowing, had read many more of the Delmars' books than the Delmars had themselves. In that day, an educated rich man was acceptable. He might send his sons to college without comment, might wear a vest and a white shirt and tie in the daytime of the weekday, might wear gloves and keep his nails clean. And since the lives and practices of rich men were mysterious, who knows what they could use or not use? But a poor man, what need had he for poetry or for painting or for music, not fit for singing or dancing? Such things did not help him bring in a crop or keep a scrap of cloth on his children's back. And if in spite of this he persisted, maybe he had reasons which would not stand to the light of scrutiny. By the way, I love that. I love that sort of characterization of and that sort of juxtaposition that Steinbeck does. Again, understanding and knowing who real people are, um, and how real people have to engage in the world. Back to the book, just this last piece here. In the first few years after Samuel came to Salinas Valley, there was a vague distrust of him, and perhaps Will, as a little boy, heard talk in the San Lucas store. Little boys don't want their fathers to be different from other men. Will might have picked up his conservatism right then. Later, as the other children came along and grew, Samuel belonged to the valley, and it was proud of him in a way a man who owns a peacock is proud. They weren't afraid of him anymore, for he did not seduce their wives or lure them out of sweet mediocrity. The Salinas Valley grew fond of Samuel, but by that time, Will was formed. Now, there's other children in this family. It's not just George and Will. So we also have the third son, Tom, who's most like his father. He was born in fury and he lived in lightning. I love that. I love that phrase. Tom came headlong into life. He was a giant in joy and enthusiasms. He didn't discover the world and its people. He created them. When he read his father's books, he was the first. He lived in a world shining and fresh and as uninspected as Eden on the sixth day. There's the biblical allusion there again, right? And then there were, of course, the little sister Molly, and of course, Samuel had another child named Joe. Joe was physically lazy and probably mentally lazy too. He daydreamed out his life, and his mother loved him more than the others because she thought he was helpless. Actually, he was the least helpless because he got exactly what he wanted with a minimum of effort. You know that we have other ways for you to engage with this show, right? We have bonus episodes featuring interviews with interesting guests, working, thinking, and of course, writing at the intersection of leadership and literature. We have shorter episodes, 15 minutes long, relaunched for this season, featuring introductions of our books and the background of our featured authors, from Augustine to Jane Austen and Ernest Hemingway to Joan Didion. So, listen, subscribe, and check out those other formats, and tell all your friends in leadership and literature about this show. I love that from Steinbeck, by the way.
Because he understood the dynamic. He understood the dynamics of human nature, right? Like that's. I guess. I guess I've kind of was. That's kind of what I was leading toward earlier, right? When I was talking about like, he just got it. Like he understood and by the way, this is a really, really good example, but something else that like I talk to my daughter about a lot. So my daughter, for those of you who don't know, she's a psychology major, right? So her and I talk a lot about behavioral patterning, changing those behaviors and the difficulties behind changing behaviors that have been around, whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
But think about this. She's just gone to school for a good amount of time, spent a tremendous amount of money at a very good university to get this insight into human nature. Steinbeck seemed to have had it naturally, that he just understood people and the dynamics and their behavioral patterns and what that meant as that behavioral pattern interacted with society. If you think just the two excerpts that you read right there, the difference between the two brothers, right?
Mm-hmm.
He understood that dynamic without having a psychology degree. That's impressive. I'm sorry, that's just impressive.
Not only not having a psychology degree, but going around, I presume, in his town and in his environment. And it's not just one example he would have seen, right? He would have seen a pastiche of examples. And then he was able to pull together. And this is an issue. This is one of the reasons why I don't think AI will ever be the thing that we think it's going to be. I think we've overblown it massively. He took the pastiche of patterns, which AI can do, and he can predict behavior, which AI can also do. But what AI can't do is take the pastiche of patterns, put them together, and then go, this is the example of a whole human being, and then make that whole human being relatable to other human beings.
Yeah. Even better, and I don't remember which character it was, but I remember seeing an article or an interview written, an interview of Steinbeck, and he was being interviewed. I'm sorry. an article about an interview of him.
Okay.
So the article written about an interview of him, and he was talking about one of his characters, and I don't remember which book it was, but they asked him where he got the idea for the character, and he's like, "Oh," and he started explaining like these three different people that
Hmm.
he grew up seeing that he said in his mind, if he could make them one person, they would be dynamic, was the phrase that he, right? So to your point about AI is not doing that either. AI
No.
is not taking three different people, their behavioral patterns, their characteristics, their actions, their thought processes, and then blending that into one human being and then writing about them as if they were a new person. Like that's
Right.
so again, I don't know if that's the only thing that AI is going to struggle with. I'm sure there are other things. I trust me. I believe that to your point, I think we've overblown what AI is going to create. I literally had a guy tell me that between 5 and 10 years from now, not the next century, but between 5 and 10 years from now, no human being is going to work anymore, and we're going to have an AI avatar that works for us, and the AI avatar is going to earn our money, and we're just going to be dependent on how good we can create our AI avatar. That is one of the most absurd things I've ever heard in my life. That we're going to see that in the next 5 years. Anyway, but to back to Steinbeck, where I think you're right, but I think it goes a layer beyond that where like he said about this one particular character. I wish I could remember which character, what book it was, but he was like, yeah, I remember this guy in my childhood, and then I met this guy over here and this guy, and he goes, and I remember thinking to myself, if these three guys could be one person. And by the way, people, I'm paraphrasing, this is not a quote from the article. I read this article a long time ago, but I remember, if I could ever find it, I would send it to you. I think you'd
Hmm.
find it fascinating, but just the way his brain worked, I feel like it was beyond his time. I think he
Hmm.
was, if he were alive today, I think he would still be read. I guess is my point. I think if he was a brand new
Yeah.
writer today, I think people would still read him.
Yes. I'll go a step further with you than that. And this is actually one of the conclusions that um, I sort of came to, not only reading East of Eden and us having a conversation about it, but then also sort of looking at Steinbeck, and I've read other things from him, obviously. And we'll bring Grapes of Wrath. We're going to talk about that book on this show. I also want to talk about Cannery Row. It is a fascinating little book. It's very, very small, very, very compact. Um, but it's about these people who live near and around a canning factory, on the shore, well, on the shore, on the right up next to the beach of the water, where they can like go get fish. They bring fish in and other seafood, and they're packing it and canning it and then sending it out. And there's so much life embedded in his descriptions of those people. I read that book when I was probably the age my youngest son is now, so probably 9 years old. I have not revisited that book since I was 9 years old, and that's damn near 40 years ago now.
Mm.
And I still remember it in vivid detail. There's the fishmonger wife, and then there's like the guy who's quite frankly lazy, but then there's the other guy who's really industrious, and then we got all this cast of characters. Um, and to your point about being able to combine things together, you're right. That was his creative genius. I think that creative genius still exists. The problem, I think, in our time, and the reason why so many modern books, particularly postmodern books, are currently struggling against AI. I think the reason for that is the kind of creative dynamism that is required to pull a psychologically and culturally relatable character together. That sort of dynamism requires, number one, a lack of distraction, which means you got to put down your phone, you got to get off the internet, you got to stop with the dopamine stuff. Number two, I think it requires time to write and to think, and to engage in critical thinking, which when you're distracted, you don't have that time because you always feel crowded. And then there are the practical distractions of life as well. But then the third thing, and I think this is huge, we've made writing as a culture and this is a cultural thing, not an individual writer thing, we've made writing an act of status. Look at the MFA programs and look at the writers' workshops. We've made it an act of status to be a writer, particularly a literary writer, like what Steinbeck would be considered to be in our time. We've made that an act of status rather than an act of, quite frankly, the way Steinbeck was, an act of grind and hard scrabble struggle.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't think we value that hard scrabble struggle as much as we say we do, you know. And this gets back to dynamics again between the city and the country and a lot of other things that tied together that Steinbeck was sort of sitting at the pinnacle of. One other thing I think that's interesting, and we haven't really gone into this, but maybe this is the place to go to. If you read this book as a leader, there are biblical allusions shot through this book. And we talked a little bit about this in our conversation on Monday. I'd like to bring this back up. The Bible, right? We did like maybe a 5-minute jog on the Bible, right?
I was wondering if we were gonna inject this, because on Monday it seemed to be a very lengthy conversation about it, and we didn't seem to get there today. But anyway, go ahead.
No, we're there now. No,
Yeah,
we're there now. We're
I'm
there
good.
now. So the title of this book is, it comes from the idea in Genesis 4 that after Cain, kills Abel, and the blood of Abel cries out from the ground to God or transcendence, however you want to think of this. Cain is of course cursed. And he, by the way, there's a great line from Cain, a number of great lines from Cain, but one of the ones that I'm going to focus on this piece anyway. He says to God, my punishment is too great for me. If you cast me out into the world, basically I'll be hunted and killed. And transcendence agrees with him and puts a mark on him, and basically says, if anyone touches Cain, I'm going to do to you what Cain just did to Abel, which is a weird sort of armor and protection, at least weird from our perspective. And then he is cast out into the land of Nod. Now, when we think about the land of Nod, we tend to think of sleeping, but the original translation of the word Nod, if I remember correctly, I read this somewhere, is wandering. It's a land of wandering east of Eden. Well, if Eden, in Steinbeck's mind, in a Californian's mind, if Eden is the East Coast, what's east of Eden? Or if Eden is the West Coast, what's east of Eden, right? Because he would have juxtaposed this with geography. Even the way in which Steinbeck put together this book. So the book ends with the last line from Adam Trask, right? Who dies, and at the end of it, to his Chinese American servant, right, named Lee, right? He says the last word of the book is Timshel, Timshel. Now, if you go and you Google this word, you're going to see a whole bunch of stuff about Timshel. This has been pulled apart by a whole bunch of different scholars.
You'll see a couple of different spellings of it as well. There's a couple of different spellings of it, etc. But go ahead, yeah.
Exactly. And Timshel comes from the idea that exists in also in the in Genesis 4. Let me go ahead and pull this up directly because I don't want to miss this. But it says, let me see. So Genesis 4, here we go. Genesis 4, chapter 6. So the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry and why has your face fallen? Verse 7. If you do well, will you not be accepted? Then and this is continued on at verse 7. And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, and you must rule over it. That line right there at the end, you must rule over it. That's the American, well, not the American, that's the ESV translation of this word Timshel. But if you go and look at some of the research around it, the Hebrew, the definition that's closer to the Hebrew is more of a thou mayest rule over it, which indicates a certain degree of, and this is really interesting, a certain degree of autonomy in creation and free will. It's not that sin is going to have its way with you, although with that term, when it's framed in that way, it is almost a, and I'm not the first person to come across this, or not to come across, but to state this this interpretation of sin will have its way with you. You can find this a lot of different places, but the way that is interpreted in the original Hebrew is that sin will basically have sexual relations with you. It will possess you, right? In that sort of meaningful way that we get when we think of sexual relations between two people. Okay. But then it switches and it says, you'll have, or transcendence says to Cain, if you resist, you'll have the ability to have free will over that. You'll have the ability to control yourself and have a certain amount of autonomy and a certain amount of choice right there. And so it's interesting that that is the word, timshel. That is the word that East of Eden ends on. And Steinbeck was obsessed with this idea. He was so obsessed with it that he carved a wooden box to send to his publisher that had the manuscript for the original manuscript for East of Eden inside the wooden box. And on the outside of the box, he carved the Hebrew sign for timshel and sent it to his publisher. So I'm saying all of that to say that when you read this book, there are biblical allusions shot through it.
There are some subtle differences though too, right? Like,
yeah,
you know, in the Bible, Cain and Abel, Cain kills Abel. In the book, you have the two brothers, Adam and
it's Adam and I'll pull it up. Go ahead.
Starts with an S.
Yes, it was Adam and Charles.
Charles.
Yep,
Yeah,
Adam and Charles. Yep.
Adam Charles. And Adam dies, but Charles isn't the one that kills him. He dies in the war.
Right.
And then but the sin part, this is the part that I find interesting about the book. I think the metaphoric sin part was Charles going and trying to kind of cozy up to Adam's wife.
Yes.
Right? Like, so like, so
yes.
to your point, there's a lot, but you need to interpret it. Like there's some things in there that you like, if I am a true reader of the Bible, and like, and I know the Bible like the back of my hand, I'm going to read this book and go, what are you talking about? It's not the same. Right. But people like you and I who read the Bible because we believe in a higher power, but we don't necessarily, I got to be very careful how I word this because I want to make sure that I'm respectful, because now anybody who has heard me on this show knows that I'm not Catholic or Christian. I'm native, but I have a lot of respect for other religions. So I try to choose my words carefully when I say things. But to me, the Bible is a collection of stories that are both mythical and truthful in nature, and human beings have kind of filled in the gaps where the gaps needed to be filled, right? So it's not verbatim, in my opinion, it's not verbatim the literal words of God, but the purpose behind it is the purpose of God. So again, I'm trying to be respectful here. I'm not saying the Bible's a bunch of garbage. That's not I would never in a million years say that. But I want to be clear, because when I read the Bible, I was reading it like a story. Like I read it as if it was any other kind of literary story, and I found it fascinating to read. And so like between Genesis, I always tell people Genesis and Revelations are my two favorite books in the Bible, right? Like it's the beginning and the end. All the stuff that happens in the middle, it's not important. It's very important to Christians and Catholics. I believe that. I believe that it's important. But to me,
yes,
I'm good with the bookends. Like I found those two books in the Bible the most fascinating, I guess. Not that they were the best to learn morals, not that they were the best for the moral compass perspective. Trust me, there's plenty of Luke and John, like there's plenty of moral compass stuff that goes in the body of the Bible. But when you look at, but if you're all this to say, if you love the Bible, you're going to think this book is, you could potentially think of this book as blasphemy, right? Like, because it basically it turns biblical things into like this thing that is not directed to be a moral compass, and not directed to teach you the difference between right and wrong, and not to teach you what sin is. It's just for fun. Like you basically turn the Bible, you turn the Genesis into a book about, I'm just going to write this for fun. Now, if you don't look at it that way and you look at it as an interpretation, I think it's very, very well done, right?
Yeah.
But again, you have to be okay with it being an interpretation.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, as a person who does believe the Bible is true, and we can discuss, this is not a topic for today,
Yeah, no.
nor is it a topic for Tom and I, and folks can come at me about this if they've made it this far into the show. And now we're into some other things, because this is deep in the show now. But I mean, like, I we can have a conversation about what true means,
That
because
too. Correct.
that
Yeah.
there's a whole bunch of different things involved in true. And true, in my opinion, and I'm just one person with an opinion, I want to be very clear on that. True, in my opinion, cannot be purely and ultimately measured in a reductionist Darwinist sort of way. You can't get there from here. It
Agreed.
minimizes reality too much, and it distills out, huh, to the point of myopia in many cases, um, important truths, and the important truth, that overwhelms and girds and undercuts and covers our entire reality. With that being said, I read East of Eden as the person who's coming from that perspective. I read
Yeah.
East of Eden not looking for parallel allusions to Genesis 4 and everything else that happens after Genesis. I read it for because it comes from a time where the audience that Steinbeck would have been writing to would have caught on to the allusions and the parallels immediately, because they were much more biblically literate in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s
Yeah.
than
Agreed.
folks are right now. Matter of fact, I'll go a step further and I will say the rural people he was describing were hyper biblically literate. And that's, by the way, been a trend in the United States for, please, centuries,
Since day one. Yeah.
since
Yeah.
day one. Um, and I think that's a fundamental difference between folks who, and I've lived in the city, but when you live in the city, you get drawn into different distractions. Like I was just saying about writers and creatives, you get drawn into different distractions and you get drawn away in different directions, and you are drawn away from the type of engagement with transcendence that a biblical worldview provides you if you are not drawn away from those things in a rural environment. Case in point, there is a whole section in the book of Genesis, it's Genesis 13, if I remember correctly, where Abram, before he's Abraham, Abram and Lot are journeying, right? In the plain, and they had just come out of Egypt, right? And Sodom and Gomorrah hadn't yet been destroyed. And Lot and Abram are having a disagreement, right? They're having a fight. And their herdsmen and the farmers are having a fight. And finally, Abram gets with Lot, who's his nephew, who he took out of the land that he came out of. And when he was called by God, takes him out of the land with him and goes journeying off, to go on the adventure of his life at the age, by the way, of 75. I always have to bring that up because it proves that, the door ain't closed until the door is closed. You can always go on the journey of your life. It's just, your hips might be a little stiffer than they were when you were 20. That's all. That's just
Hey, listen, I'm just
transcendence.
saying, when I'm 75, I'm not walking across the desert. I'm just letting you know that right
well,
now.
well, 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 if transcendence calls you, Tom, you might want to answer the call.
Yeah, that's true. That is true. That is true.
But
The creator gives me direction. I'm going to take it, but I
it,
just can't see him asking me to walk across the desert at 75. He knows me better than that, Hassan. I'm just saying.
well,
Anyway,
he may ask you to go on a different kind of adventure, maybe not
yeah,
walking across the desert, right?
exactly.
um but when Abram gets this call, he takes his nephew because he wanted friends and his wife and his stuff, and he goes, right, okay. So they wandered, they've done the thing, they're getting ready to settle down, and there's this massive plain, right? It's described in the biblical account as the plain of Jordan, right? And in the biblical account, it says it was well watered everywhere, and by the way, the biblical account makes a point of this, before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest up into Zoar. Then Lot chose him. This is the thing, all the plain of Jordan. So Abram got one spot, and Lot looked at all the plain of Jordan and was like, I'm going to take all of this. Now, Lot was, this is an interesting point. This is the interesting point I'm going to about cities. And Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves one from another. Abram dwelled in the land of Canaan, and Lot dwelled not in the land of Canaan, in the cities of the plain, and pitched his tent towards Sodom. But the men of Sodom were wicked and sinners before the Lord exceedingly. That's also something that I think Steinbeck is trying to get to in here. Not necessarily that living in LA is wicked or living in San Francisco or whatever. No, there's righteous people there. This is the whole point of Abraham, bargaining with God about the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Of course, there's 50 righteous people. And if there aren't, Lot, or Abraham's great question to God, if there's not, shall not the judge of all the earth do right? Shall we not have a negotiation? Shall we not have an agreement to save the righteous? Shall the righteous be destroyed along with the wicked? Right? Okay. I don't think Steinbeck was saying that living in a city is a place of wickedness, but I think he was addressing in East of Eden the tension, and he was making a choice, by the way, the tension between the rural and the urban. He was addressing that tension because in 1952, post World War II America, he could see that coming with the building of the suburbs, people pushing out from the cities, but not quite going back to the country, cities expanding. And by the way, there's something to this. So if you look up the statistics, going into 2050, about 25 years from now, when I will be still around, hopefully, good Lord willing, and the creek don't rise, by 2050, 89% of the U.S. population and 68% of the world population is projected to live in urban areas in 25 years. That's a lot of people crammed into cities.
Yeah.
And there's something that you lose there. I'm not saying you become Sodom, but I'm saying there's something that you lose. And Steinbeck understood that tension, and he was writing to an audience that understood that tension and was on the other side of that tension, culturally and also psychologically. And he was trying to appeal to them in biblical terms. And so they would have gotten that.
In terms they would understand. He was
right.
giving them an opportunity to, again, like I said a second ago, he was giving them opportunity to interpret this in their brain in a way that made sense to them.
Right. And part of the reason why this book has never not been a bestseller is because if you go past the rural urban divide part and you go up a scale level, it's for everyone, regardless of where you live. You're going to find something in this book that you're going to relate to.
Speaking of never been not a bestseller, did you end up looking up any of that information about? I saw somewhere, at least I'm pretty sure I read somewhere that literally every single year, 50,000 copies of this book are sold
Yes.
worldwide. Like, did you actually look that up? Is that accurate?
Yes, that's accurate.
Somewhere
Yep.
around that number.
Mm-hmm.
That to me that is just simply incredible. That like to have that kind of staying power is insane to me.
Well, and it was also resurrected. Gosh, what is it, like 15 years ago now? Might have been 15 years ago now. Remember when Oprah was doing her book club? I
Oh,
was
she had
hesitant
her
to,
book club. Yeah, yeah, I
yeah, I
did
was
see
hesitant to mention this, but she glommed onto East of Eden, right? And there were a lot of people at the time who, Jonathan Franzen was one of them who didn't want Oprah to even touch his book, which I'm sure he's kicking himself now about that, but in some room somewhere where no one's reading his books, but poor bastard. Anyway, and actually, Jonathan Franzen is a good writer. Like I like his books. I think that he's a good magnum opus writer, but I also think that you have to kind of understand the time in which you're in and sort of really make some cognizant decisions as a writer and a creator, sort of on not sort of but on purpose and intentionally, And I think he was a little too casual with the anti-Oprah thing. I don't think he sort of understood sort of where that was going to go. But anyway, one of the points that folks like him made was that if Steinbeck had been alive and Oprah's book club had been stamped on the cover of East of Eden, he would have objected to that as well. And I don't think they're correct on that. I don't think that's true. I think Steinbeck would have said, this black lady has gotten enough cachet to be able to bring my book forward. Okay, that's fine. What's the problem?
No, I agree with that. I don't think he would have cared. I don't, not that he would not have cared. I quite the opposite. I think he might have even leaned into it, to be
Yeah,
honest. Again,
yeah,
as we talked before about how he saw the value in people for what their value, what they brought to the table, not what he wanted them to bring to the table, not to what he hoped they brought to the table. He saw value in people for what they actually brought to the table. So I
yeah.
think if that is true, and that entire conversation that we had about that the other day
Mm-hmm.
is true, then you're right. He would have saw Oprah and the value that she brought and just ran with it. I don't think he would
Yep.
have questioned it. I don't think he would have bucked it. I think he would have just been perfectly okay with it. And I think he would have, again, he was such a good observer of people. I think he would
Mm-hmm.
have predicted that. I think he would have saw it coming, so to speak,
Yeah,
before
yeah.
my gut tells me that Steinbeck would have seen Oprah become Oprah before she even knew what she was doing, like that she was Oprah. I
Perhaps.
think he just
Yeah,
would have seen it. I think he would have
yeah.
seen it, and I think he would have been okay with it. I think he would have been more than okay with it. I think he would have leaned into it.
Well, and he died before civil rights really became, sort of a thing. And we didn't sort of mention this previously, but I'll mention it now. He was fundamentally, at the end of the day, not just a person from California, but he was a man of the West,
Yeah,
capital W regional West, like American West. And in race relations in this country, we never talk about regionality unless it's the South versus everybody else.
right.
But let me tell you something. I've lived in the West, and currently in Texas, I live in the western part of Texas, not the southern part of Texas. That's East Texas. That's over there with those people, and that's fine. Um, West Texas and the West in general. I mean, the first 12 years of my life I spent in New Mexico. Um, the West in the West, race relations are fundamentally different. The battles are different than they are other places because of the nature of, as we opened up with East of Eden, the nature of who settled that place and what their posture was towards all of those kinds of issues. So he was a man of that time, and so I don't think he would have been, to your point, I think that's another reason why he would not have been opposed to Oprah basically putting the stamp on his book. Okay, let's talk about meaning. Let's talk about what we talked a lot about this book. We've read some pieces from it. We talked about the influences. We talked about Steinbeck coming all the as part of that sort of mid 20th century um, pinnacle of of understanding human nature, being able to sort of bring dynamic personalities together and really make them creatively interesting. Talked about the biblical allusions in this book, and of course, the nature of the Trasks and the Hamiltons and the people that are winding together through this multi-generational narrative. What can leaders take from all of this? If I'm a leader and I'm listening to this podcast, what do I get from East of Eden? What do I take? Why is it worth my while to read this 1,000-page book?
Well, I think honestly, I think I just said it. I'm just like because I think from a leadership perspective, I think that we as leaders have got to stop trying to fit square pegs into round holes and start leveraging the talents and the uh and the people that we have, right? Meaning
Mm-hmm.
like I just said a second ago, Steinbeck found value in people at its face. He wasn't looking to change somebody into something they weren't or move somebody from point A to point B because that's where he thought they should be. He just didn't do that. He was able to take people and understand their value, and then turn that value intrinsically into activity into the book, in the book, right? Like a
Mm.
character in the
Yep.
book or whatever. So if we're looking at it from a leadership perspective and we're reading this book and we're truly understanding that dynamic that he's talking about, then we can look at our teams, whether you have one team or 10 teams, and start really identifying the people in those teams and whether or not they bring value to that team based on just who they are, and not trying to
Mm.
change them into something we don't. By the way, guys, that doesn't mean that you have to keep everybody in your team. If they don't fit, fire them and find somebody else. I'm not suggesting that you have to work with what you got and you can never change it, but I'm saying that learning from Steinbeck's ability to find value in every single person that he was able to encounter and then turn that value into something amazing like that book. We have that ability. We have that ability to look at the people that work for us, the people that work with us, and the people that we work for, understand who they are as people, their values, their morals, their go back to the biblical sense. Whether you are Catholic or Christian or not, that does not mean that you don't value a moral compass. Like,
Hmm.
I mean, you whether I don't care what religion or what faith you support, I would imagine having a moral compass is going to be important to you. Do people understand the difference between right and wrong? Are you going to have that? Like, and making sure that the right people fit the right circumstances for us. I just think all of that is in there, right? Like that's, I
Yeah.
think all of it is. I think all of it is in there, and you can learn from it if you're looking to learn from it. I think that's
Hmm.
that's the thing that I think people sometimes forget that, like, if you, and again, you're probably one of the few people that, and I know I try to do this. I don't know if I do it really well, but you're one of the few people that I know that will read a book and not just read it simply for pleasure. You're always looking at it from an angle perspective, or maybe you have certain books you do this with, or certain books you don't. But from what I've learned from you, it's there's always underlying tones and underlying lessons to be learned from these books and these authors that you're reading. So to just simply read something because you just want to have a mind-numbing experience, to me, doesn't exist. So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
I think if you're taking your time to read something, you should have some sort of benefit from it, whether it's personal, professional, whatever that is. And I think in East of Eden, especially, and Steinbeck in general, and I know we talked about this on Monday, because quite honestly, I don't care whether you're reading East of Eden or Mice of Men or Grapes of Wrath or The Cannery. I don't care what any of those Steinbeck books are going to tell you, that he values people for what they are and who they are and what they bring to the table naturally. And I think that if we can learn from that, then we will become better leaders.
He even values people who we don't understand because you can learn something from everything and something from
Correct.
everyone. Let me pick this up here. This is a good segue into this. East of Eden, part two, chapter 8, part 1. He opens up with this line. I love this line. I believe there are monsters born in the world to human parents. Some you can see, misshapen and horrible, with huge heads or tiny bodies. Some are born with no arms, no legs, some with 3 arms, some with tails or mouths in odd places. They are accidents and no one's fault, as used to be thought. Once they were considered the visible punishments for concealed sins. There's that biblical allusion again, folks. And just as there are physical monsters, can there not be mental or psychic monsters born? The face and body may be perfect, but if a twisted gene or a malformed egg can produce physical monsters, may not the same process produce a malformed soul? By the way, pause. Clearly, Steinbeck was asking the question about, do we have souls or not? Which, by the way, is a worthwhile question for our time right now. And
Right
we
now.
better get real quick. We better get real clear on this one real quick, because otherwise we're going to outsource the best stuff from our souls to mechanical men. We're already starting to see that happen. Back to the book. Monsters are variations from the accepted normal to a greater or lesser degree. As a child may be born without an arm, so one may be born without kindness or the potential of conscience. A man who loses his arms in an accident has a great struggle to adjust himself to the lack, but one born without arms suffers only from the people who find him strange. Having never had arms, he cannot miss them. Sometimes when we are little, we imagine how it would be to have wings, but there is no reason to suppose it's the same feeling birds have. No. To a monster, the norm must seem monstrous, since everyone is normal to himself. That is a huge insight, by the way. Everyone is normal to himself. To the inner monster, it must be even more obscure, since he has no visible thing to compare with others. To a man born without conscience, a soul-stricken man must seem ridiculous. To a criminal, honesty is foolish. You must not forget that a monster is only a variation, and that to a monster, the norm is monstrous. And this is his introduction. And I wrote at the beginning of this chapter, because I make notes in all my books that I read for this podcast and books that I read just for my own, to Tom's point, pleasure. The note that I made was the making of a sociopath. This is what he is describing here. and again,
which I think is also fascinating, because you think about like Freud, the father of modern psychology, died in
mm-hmm,
1939, 38, 39, 40, somewhere around there.
yeah,
So like so Steinbeck's writing when all this stuff is coming out new. Like this is all new
mm-hmm,
to them about like the what a sociopath is, psychology, and like I think this is his inner turmoil about like science, and I think this is where he starts going down the other side of the slope, because you talk
yep,
about how, when he was growing up, he was Christian growing up, and he
yep,
became agnostic later in life. I
yep,
think this is part of it, because seeing what Freud was doing and then being able to word what you just read, that's his brain saying, like should we be leaning more toward biblical, or should we leaning more toward science?
right. How do we
Like that.
how
I
do we
think that's
square
what
this
he's asking
circle?
himself.
Yeah. How do we square this circle? How do we make, as the kids say these days, make it make sense? Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah.
um Back to the book for just a moment. He says, it is my belief that Kathy Ames was born with the tendencies or lack of them which drove and forced her all of her life. Some balance wheel was misweighted, some gear out of ratio. She was not like other people, never was from birth. And just as a cripple may learn to utilize his lack so that he becomes more effective in a limited field than the uncrippled, so did Kathy, using her difference, make a painful and bewildering stir in her world. There was a time when a girl like Kathy would have been called possessed by the devil. She would have been exorcised to cast out the evil spirit. And if after many trials that did not work, to Tom's point, she would have been burned as a witch for the good of the community. I'm going to go back to that in a second. Just keep going with the book. The one thing that may not be forgiven a witch is her ability to distress people, to make them restless and uneasy and even envious. Then it goes into a description of her and her body and her hands, and it's a very graphic description, folks. So just gonna keep that in mind. Um, and then we go to this. Um, Kathy was a liar, but did not lie the way most children do. Hers was no daydream lying when the thing imagined is told, and to make it seem more real, told as real. That's just an ordinary deviation from external reality. I think the difference between a lie and a story is that a story utilizes the trappings and appearance of truth for the interest of the listener as well as of the teller. That is a great description, by the way, of what an author actually does. A story, back to the book, a story has in it neither gain nor loss, but a lie is a device for profit or escape. I suppose if that definition is strictly held to, then a writer of stories is a liar, if he is financially fortunate. Kathy's lies were never innocent. Their purpose was to escape punishment or work or responsibility, and they were used for profit. Most liars are tripped up either because they forget what they have told or because the lie is suddenly faced with an incontrovertible truth. But Kathy did not forget her lies, and she developed the most effective method of lying. She stayed close enough to the truth so that one could never be sure. She knew two other methods also, either to interland her lies with truth or to tell the truth as though it were a lie. If one is accused of a lie and it turns out to be the truth, there is a backlog that will last a long time and protect a number of other untruths. Order my latest book, 12 Rules for Leaders, The Foundation of Intentional Leadership, with Bradley Madigan. This book offers insights, ideas, and presents a framework for addressing the most pressing challenges in the postmodern leadership landscape we are navigating today. Pick up the paperback, hardcover, or ebook everywhere you buy books, and leave a review on Amazon. And thanks. Talk about the psychology of a sociopath, the making of a monster, and then the very next chapter is the making of a, not a sociopath, but a psychopath, because she eventually runs into a psychopath. And which, of course, answers the question, what happens when a psychopath and a sociopath meet? It's not good. Let's just frame it that way. Somebody has to lose. It's like George, Henry Kissinger's quip during the Iran-Iraq War. He said infamously back in the 1980s, infamously, it's a pity that both sides couldn't lose. Which has always sort of amused me at a geopolitical level. And Kissinger, I have my own concerns about his mental health. But anyway, or had about his mental health. But anyway, the thing about Kathy, and this is why I wanted to bring it up, even close to the close here of our show today. Kathy is, on the one hand, yes, she's clearly, I'm going to use the term here, demonically evil. She is seeking to manipulate and gain power. She commits murder. She is out for money and for greed, and she ruins a whole bunch of people, including her own kids. She train wrecks a whole bunch of people. And by the way, Steinbeck, basing this on people he saw, right, and behaviors he actually saw, was trying to make sense of this. But Kathy is also, just like all of the other characters in the book, from the Hamiltons to the Trasks and their entire family and all the dynamics that happen in there, including like deaths that just come out of nowhere, failures of the land, failures of farming, failures of animals. She's a tragic figure. And this is the part that I think in our current era, we have a lot of movies that try to make the villain relatable, or even try to, weirdly enough, turn the villain into a hero. And I have a problem with that as a storytelling trope, because sometimes people are just evil and you don't need to know that daddy didn't hug them. Like, it doesn't matter. People are just evil.
Right.
And that's okay to say. It's fine. Now, the reason we don't say that is because we want to have it both ways. Because if there's gray area, then kind of the things that I do, well, then I can't be judged, and it goes to this whole, like,
or we want the Deadpools of the world, right? Do bad things for the right reason or whatever. And
right.
like, is that really that much better? Is that
no.
better? I don't think so. I don't think so. I'm with you on that.
Yeah. No. We need to get back to, yes, you can know evil. Yes, there is objective evil, just like there's objective good. And there's no confusion about this. We actually know. And we, by the way, you know how we know? In our lives, when objective evil is done to us, we cry out for justice. That's how we know there's objective evil. That's how we know. Anyway, and that's how we know we can identify it. But the piece of it that we're missing, the part that we confuse with the gray area in our time, is the tragedy of evil, the tragic nature of it, and not just the outcomes of evil, but also the environment that produces that evil. Because Kathy is not described as learning how to be evil. She's described as being evil from birth. That's why he opens up with the whole, like, comparison to a malformed body, right? Can you have a malformed soul? And that is I think, a extremely challenging question, specifically for our time, because we don't even believe in the soul, much less that it could be malformed, or we struggle with that belief. And then when evil happens to us, or when there are genuinely evil people in the world, we have no answer for them. We have no answer for their behavior, other than, and this is the failure of Nuremberg, other than to appeal to some sort of morality that comes from nowhere, and basically just to say, well, this morality that comes from nowhere, we're going to put upon you, and we're going to lock you up in jail. And of course, the evil person looks at that decision not as justice, but as the leveraging of power over them. and thus learns nothing and changes nothing. You have to have a moral element. You have to admit that there's objective truth. You have to admit that there's objective evil. You have to admit that there's objective good. And you have to say, as Steinbeck struggled with, and it's okay to struggle with this question, but you have to at least admit that this is the question: by whose authority are we determining these objectives? And we have to name that authority. And in a book that has biblical allusions, Steinbeck was clearly saying that that authority is a transcendent God, and we can still wrestle with that. That's okay, and we should. Yeah. For leaders, thoughts on what do you do? What do you do if you have a narcissist? Because that's a term that's thrown around quite a bit. Everybody's a narcissist these days. You know, if you have a narcissist in your organization, or maybe even you have a sociopath or a psychopathic behaving person, without a and these are not clinical definitions, by the way. I want to be very clear. These are not clinical definitions. If we want to get a clinical definition of one of my guests, I could bring on and give a clinical definition of all this, but this is not what we're talking about.
Last time I checked, Jesan and I are not psychologists, psychiatrists, or any of the like. So
right, like I have no degrees, no certifications. Yeah, this is pure conjecture, right? But if you're a leader and you're seeing behavior that's objectively bad, objectively not good, how do you deal with that on your team? How do you deal with that in a world where, Johnny just didn't get hugged?
Let me add to your question and see how you answer to this one as well, because not only okay, so observationally watching somebody do things that are not bad, fine. Okay, I get that. That's bad, inherently evil. We don't want people doing that. But what happens if you try to redirect them? You try to give them corrective actions. You try to give them opportunity to do the right thing and they choose not to. I know what I would do. I think for me, the answer is very simple. That person's not on my team anymore. See you later. Yep. And you're no longer my problem. You're somebody else's problem at that point. But am I wrong in doing that? Like, should I be thinking about ways to be more lenient, to be more inclusive, be more willing to be patient with those corrections? I don't know, but I will tell you, I only have a certain tolerance level for that stuff. So and if I point it out to you and you have no interest in correcting your behavior, then I have no interest in having you on my team.
So for me, because you're asking me this question, for me, if I'm leading a team of folks and someone is doing something that's objectively bad, right, for the team, I'm going to ask, there's a series of cascading sort of questions I'm going to ask. But I am going to see that as objectively bad, and I'm going to confront that person. That's one of the first things that I'm going to do, because I've learned that if you confront a person who is let's just start with the lying part, okay? If you confront a person who's a liar with objective truth, and by the way, a liar relies on everybody going along with the lie. That's where they get the power, because everybody just goes along with the lie. Well, the most dangerous person on any team, and it doesn't have to be the leader, the designated leader or the positional leader, it can be anybody on the team. The most dangerous person on that team is going to be the person who doesn't go along with the objective lie. It doesn't go along with the lack of objective truth. That's going to be the most dangerous person. This is why we have protections for whistleblowers and things like that, because that person not only is dangerous, but is in danger, but is also in danger. Okay. So for me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to confront that person first. Then the second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to not try to save that person, but I'm going to sort of take the attitude of, my favorite superhero, Batman. I don't have to save you. Okay. I'm not obliged to rescue you, and I'm not going to get out of the way of your consequence. So as long as consequences are clear, all I am is the deliverer of consequences. That's all at the end of the day. Yeah. I'm not the boss. I'm not the leader. I am the deliverer of consequences. That's the other thing that people sometimes get caught up on. They get caught up on do I have the power to deliver the consequence, or do I have the power to accept accountability if the consequence doesn't work? And it becomes a very power oriented mini Nuremberg trial sort of weird sort of, we're going to have the morality without the appeal to the objective sort of kind of moment. And people don't use those terms, but that's basically what they're doing, right? At a psychological level, that's what they're doing. And I think you have to let go of all of that. I think you have to say, no, you know what? It's tragic. This is the tragic part. It's tragic that you lied. It's tragic that these are the consequences. Have a good day. Goodbye. And by the way, when your future employer calls me and asks me questions, and the final question, of course, will be, would you rehire this person? I'm going to be honest, because I'm not going to lie. And I'm going to say, no, I'm not going to rehire that person. And when they ask me why, because of course, none of those interview questions, I've been through a few of those interviews for former employees, and none of my former employees, let me go on record, none of my former employees have I ever had to have this sort of hypothetical conversation about. I never had any of these kinds of problems, right? I ran into people in other venues that have lied to me, but not who I was leading or on teams that I was on. But if I had, those series of questions, they don't typically ask, did this person lie about XYZ or ABC? That's not typically something HR is looking for, but it's in that rehire question. Would you rehire this person? And the answer, of course, is no. No, I wouldn't rehire a liar. Well, why wouldn't you rehire this person? Well, let me tell you a story, man. Not what I thought about it, not what I felt about it, but here's what practically happened.
Here's a fun fact, though. In the state of Massachusetts, you're not allowed to answer that question.
Really?
You can answer,
wow,
would you rehire this person? And they can say, no, I would not rehire this person. And if they say why, and you answer it, you can get sued very, very deeply in the state of Massachusetts, because it could be considered defamation. It could be considered like all kinds of stuff, because if the words that come out of your mouth next are closer to opinion than fact, then it opens up that company to a lot of liability.
Interesting.
So in the state of Massachusetts, they will tell you, you are allowed to answer 3 questions on a referral or on a reference.
Yeah.
Did they work for you? Yes or no? What was the time frame that they worked for you? Can you can you verify their position? Like what was their role? And would you rehire them? That's it. That's it. That is a reference in the state of Massachusetts.
Well, I guess in the state of Massachusetts, even liars got to eat. And I guess the state of Massachusetts is gonna protect the liars, because God forbid the liars don't eat. But maybe my pushback on that, and this is my only pushback thought, and the state of Massachusetts is going to do whatever the state of Massachusetts does. This is
well, and I can tell you the theory behind it is just simply, if you and I are working together, you're my boss, and we just don't get along, you could, and like, I didn't technically do anything wrong, but you replaced me because we just weren't a good personality fit. Then you could go and then vilify that person on the reference.
Right. And the kinds of things we're talking about, the Kathy Ameses of the world are edge cases, right? I genuinely think there are edge cases. Yeah.
At least in the state of Massachusetts, and I'm not trying to defend them here, but in their defense, they're thinking that those are outliers, that those are statistical anomalies, that generally people will leave a job because they weren't a good fit. And you don't want to then penalize them and not be, to your point, they still have to feed their families. So, and if they're really not that good of a person, you're going to see it on their resume anyway, because they've had 8 jobs in the last 5 years, right? Like you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that there's a problem there. But but they just don't want to add fuel. They don't want to allow people to add fuel to the fire, I guess is the point. To your point a few minutes ago, it's like working through Dragnet. State the fact, just the facts, ma'am. Just give me the facts. Yeah. I do not want to hear your opinion as to why that person doesn't work there anymore.
Right.
I want to hear facts. Fact, did they work there? Yes. Fact, is this how much money they made? Fact, is this the dates and times they worked there? And would you rehire them? Should tell you everything you need to know. If they say no, I would not rehire them, what is the reasoning does not matter. Who the hell cares? That is a red flag to me that I'm not overcoming with a simple, Well, but why? Was it your fault or theirs? Like, who the hell cares? I don't care
Right.
if they say no. If they say no, I move on to the next candidate.
Well, and I'm sure there's also some sort of Title VII, Title IX,
Yeah.
some sort of Civil Rights Act sort of interpretation underneath this as well, which I'm sure is again appealing to what? Like, what are we appealing to here? And again, this is my philosophical sort of perspective on this at a practical level. Again, I have not experienced an edge case like that. Practically speaking, if I were pragmatically speaking, if I were to face an edge case like that, yeah, I'd get rid of that person because that person has to go. Now, also, let's be very clear. The likelihood that that person is going to put me down as a reference where I'm even going to get that call is probably going to be minimal at best. At
Which
best.
is, by the
So
way, when I hire people, that's why I don't ask them for references. I just go straight off their resume and just call random people on their resume. I don't even ask them. I don't
right.
want to know why.
Yeah.
I just want to
Yeah.
know. And by the way, I don't even care if like, so again, at our age, can you remember the dates and times of all the places that you worked? Probably
No.
not. I can give my best guess. So I don't even double check that, to be honest with you. If somebody says they
Yeah.
worked there for 2 years, that's usually the question I have. I don't say, did they work there from this date to this date? I would just say, did they work there for about 2 years? Yeah, something like that sounds about right. Okay, and then I move on. Like I don't care what the actual dates are. But like,
Well, and
because again, and it's not that I think they're lying. I just think sometimes your memory fails you in remembering the actual dates and time. So my only question I really want to know is, would you rehire them? If given the opportunity and the circumstances were right for you, would you rehire them? And if they
well,
say
and
probably or maybe, that's good enough for me too. Like if I
yeah.
just don't want to
Okay.
hear no. I just don't want to
Right.
hear no. No, I absolutely would not hire them again. Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Have a nice day.
Right. Right.
You know what I mean?
Um,
Like, so anyway,
well,
I
and
don't. We're a little off track here, but
no. It's okay. It's okay because this gets into okay. So that's the extreme edge case, right? We're talking about the liar who's clearly lying. That's
yeah,
the Kathy Ames type. Let's go down the let's go down the register a little bit,
the
right?
sociopathic scale.
Sure. Let's go down the sociopathic scale to your garden variety narcissist who
Yeah,
takes credit for projects that aren't theirs, talks over other people in the meeting, um, stays within the boundaries of whatever is approved in HR language of behavior or whatever, but is always kind of riding the edge, kind of slightly. Um, and also is loved by a certain cadre of people and by the way, those cadre of people are influential. One of those cadre of people might be your boss, and thus feels as though they protected themselves from being fired. This kind of person is rife in our organizations, right? And the term, of course, that's thrown around for this person is narcissist all of the time. How as a leader do we deal with the narcissists? Because we do see a lot of this. And by the way, I think we're seeing more narcissists because of social media and because of the impact of the internet plus social media and the performative nature of the way we live our lives out online that has now spilled out into the real world. I think that's the reason behind it. I think this is a relatively new thing. And by new, I mean within the last 15 or 20 years of work culture. I think people were just as narcissistic in the 1980s, in the 1970s, 1950s, 1960s. Hell, they were just as narcissistic when they were making straw without bricks at the end of Genesis, or at the beginning, actually the beginning of Exodus. Sorry. They were just as narcissistic then. They just didn't have as many outlets for their narcissism. We've given people more outlets for narcissism. Thus, the number of times we see that behavior and can recognize it in real life in other people has increased, particularly in our workplaces. What as leaders do we do with the garden variety narcissist who we can't quite fire, but we know they're going to be a problem at every meeting?
I wonder also, like before I answer that, I wonder also
Yeah.
if we sometimes confuse narcissist with self-preservation, right? Like, so
Ooh,
if you,
that's good.
you could come across as a narcissist if you are in defense mode all the time, or if you are
Sure.
in fight like that. If your fight or flight is invoked and you decide to fight, sometimes you look like a narcissist and you're just defending your position on something, or you know what I mean? Like, I think
Hmm.
sometimes to your point a second ago, I don't know if we're truly seeing more narcissistic behavior or if we're seeing more behavior that feels like they need to be that they're defending themselves, or that they have to put themselves in a position of uh, detraction of attention, so to speak, right?
Hmm.
Like the boss is coming down on a project, this isn't getting done. It's not my fault. I did this, this, and this. So don't look at me. Like it's
Yeah.
self-preservation more than it is narcissism. Now, again, is that true or not? I don't know. I wonder about that though, if that
Mm.
is the case. And in those environments, I feel like that because again the situation I just gave you, like if you have a project going as a team, then you are successful or you fail as that team. Stop singling people out. Like stop allowing your team to say, well, I did my part, so and so didn't do theirs. That's not relevant. If you are going to be successful or failed, if you're going to be judged success or failure by the team, then start forcing the team to view it that way. I think that's number
Hmm.
one. If it's not a team event and if it's not a team activity and you are simply judging people based on their own merit, then it's not narcissism. That like you're asking them, did you do this? Did you do it well enough for me to recognize you? And if the answer
Hmm.
is yes, then it's not narcissism, it's matter of fact. Right? I think where we get really caught up in the jets of narcissism is when we look at a team and we are judging that team as individuals and not as a team. Well, then stop calling them the team. Like, you know what I mean? Like
Hmm.
if it's not a team event, then stop calling it a team event, and maybe some of that narcissism goes away.
Yeah, maybe it does. And you know what? And this is, we'll close out with this. Um, I think we have to be careful about language, right? So,
Hey, words have
um,
power, people. It
words
may
have
be the
power.
only, it may only be the power that we give it, but it's still we give words power, so words have power. Just
Words have
remember that.
power. Yeah. Um, what can we take from East of Eden into well, into the next 25 years of growth in America? I mean, the vast majority of our population is going to live in cities. If the census numbers are to be believed, if the trend lines, the demographic lines continue to go in the same direction that they are predicted to go in, um, we are going to have a culture, and I'm talking about at a cultural level. We're going to have a culture that is going to want to see and read, when they do read, more stories that relate to the environments they are in, which is natural for human beings. And if you're in a city environment or a suburban environment, you're going to want to see stories, read stories, consume culture that reflects that reality back to you. That way you feel like you have agency over that reality. Um, a minority of people are going to live in rural areas. And while they may be underserved in those areas, they're of course going to have iPhones or whatever the phone is of the day. They're going to be able to consume that content coming from those city areas and those city creators. I think of the writer Taylor Sheridan, the writer of Yellowstone, right? Who, you know, infamously was in his hagiographic story of building Yellowstone. He was told that, we don't, he was told by a Hollywood executive that, we don't accept stories that are set in rural areas because we can't market them to an urban audience. And we've been doing that at least since the 1970s. So go back and try again. And again, how much truth there is to that story, who knows, right? It may just be part of the hagiography of Taylor Sheridan, right? The myth of Taylor Sheridan that he's building, right? Um, and because two things can be true at once, I do think that there is a hunger or a thirst or a need for stories that are set in rural areas like East of Eden that do show nature and do show the land and do show the struggles of struggling against the ruthlessness of the natural world, to remind people who live in the cities that it's not all just smooth and easy, and all you got to deal with is these wackadoo other human beings, of which there are a lot of. There's also this other world that lives out here that we're actually a part of. We're just sort of cut off from it because of our technology and our concrete and our buildings. And we need to, as the kids would say these days, we need to touch grass. We need to get outside and like get connected back with that. So, final thoughts on that. Where do we go with East of Eden? Will it still be a bestseller in 25 years, do we think? I mean, I think it will, because it addresses human nature, but I wonder if there will be, I wonder if the interest will wane. Maybe it won't sell 50,000 copies. Maybe it'll only sell 15,000, right? Because there just won't be a way for us to sort of relate to that anymore based on our lived experience.
Well, I can't, I won't predict it. All I can say is I hope that
Yeah.
writers like Steinbeck are still being read in 2050, because I think, to what we talked about earlier, I think his observation of human nature is worth it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think human nature is going to change all that dramatically in the next 25 years.
No.
I think, I think so. I think it's going to be relevant for a long time. And I think, again, I'm not predicting this, but I'm saying this is a hopefulness.
Mm-hmm.
Like I said, probably more than once already on this episode here. I think his magic power comes from being able to find value in people, or to find the value in people, and then lean into that value instead of trying to change people and motivate people. He doesn't try to do any of that. He just sees who they are and leans into it. And I think that as as a society, if we can do a little bit more of that and stop trying to mold people into who we want them to be, we're going to be better off for it. So hopefully, and again, I'm not saying this as a prediction, but hopefully writers like Steinbeck don't go away at all, and people just start, to your point about, sometimes things circle back, right? And
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
sometimes we lose sight of something, and somebody like Oprah comes along and says, "Hey, by the way, have you seen this classic book? You should read it." And all of a sudden, it's back in the bestseller, right? Maybe the next Oprah does the same thing. I don't know who that's going to be, but you never know. Maybe it's the writer or the creative person that takes East of Eden and finally turns it into a on-screen event, whether it's a
Mm-hmm.
miniseries or a movie or whatever. I feel like I think Hollywood's doing us a disservice by not putting this on film. And again,
Mm-hmm.
maybe it's a miniseries, maybe it's not a movie in a theater, but maybe Netflix grabbed a hold of it and turns it into an 8-episode
Yeah.
series.
Yeah.
I would watch that. Oh, I would watch that more than once. I think, because
Yeah.
Grapes of Wrath was turned into a movie. It was fantastic. Mice of Men was turned into a movie. That was fantastic. I don't understand why this has not been yet, but I think it should be. And I think that may be the way that we get Steinbeck to be a little bit more sticky for the next 25 years, is to take East of Eden and turn it into a film. So if anyone's listening to this that has access to Hollywood, get this on film. I will
Immediately.
watch it.
You've got 2 viewers here. I'll watch it too. I will be on that. I will be on that, and hope and get a good writer. Get a writer who actually like loves not just California, I would say, but a writer who loves the dichotomy, the tension between the rural and the urban, and understands that, and understands the nature not only of the biblical allusions, but also can fall in love with them. I'm not saying they have to believe in them, but can fall in love with them and really do honor to Steinbeck's work and Steinbeck's efforts. All right, that's all we got for today. I think we're good here. We've now talked for 4 hours. This is the longest we've talked about one book. 4 hours total, beating Miyamoto Musashi's A Book of Five Rings, where I talked with John Hill, aka Small Mountain, 4 hours about the book the Book of Five Rings, most downloaded episode the first 2 years of this podcast. But we've talked for a total of 4 hours about East of Eden. So go out, grab East of Eden by John Steinbeck. You will not regret it. I'd like to thank Tom Libby for coming on our recorded podcast today.
Always my pleasure. It was so pleasurable for me. I did it twice.
There you go. And with that, I'm out.